Hi, I'm Josh Mulvihill, pastor for about 20 years.
You're a pastor?
Yep.
Where?
Minnesota, Grace Church of Eden Prairie.
Okay. Is that John Piper's church?
Down the road.
Okay, wonderful. Great. Great.
Yes.
So what brings you to Rockwall, Texas?
Legacy Grandparent Summit. I'm on staff with the Legacy Coalition. I'm their Director of Resources. So there's about 30 million Christian grandparents in America that we assume. And there's only a handful of resources for all the grandparents.
Okay.
So my job is to resource all 30 million Christian grandparents to help grandparents do what they're called to do.
Okay, but let me ask a question here. I mean, the obvious question is, you don't look like you're old enough to be a grandparent.
I'm not.
Okay.
So I went back to school, get a PhD in family ministry, saw the grandparent need that was out there, the immense hole that was not addressed resource-wise, theologically, and also in churches. When I was doing this, started about 6 years ago, we couldn't find a single church in the country that had a grandparent ministry. 7 resources existed on book, DVD, that were written in a 15-year span, and there just was this huge hole for this massive group, and so I felt like God opened my eyes to that and put that call in my life, and so spent a number of years. So I have a PhD in family ministry with my work is my doctorate and dissertation is on the biblical role of grandparenting.
Oh, that's neat. Is that paper online?
It's in a book if you want to get it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
So I talk a ton about the cultural messages that grandparents hear, and the fact that they're told to be independent and to be indulgent on their grandkids. And when that gets adopted and absorbed, grandparents have a difficult time doing what the Bible calls them to.
Okay.
So I love to encourage grandparents along that line.
So you mentioned something that I thought was very good. You said about 7 years ago it was that there were basically no grandparent ministries available in the church, or
there's 0. One nationally, one grandparent ministry.
And how many ministers are there available right now? Any idea?
Yeah, so I think we're probably closing in on about 50 different churches that have launched something, and we're hoping that in this next year there's 200, and in a couple of years there's hundreds. So it's taken a while for people to awaken up to that reality.
So what you're saying is, as far as especially North American culture, we talk about parents, and grandparents are kind of like pushed to the side someplace. A biblical view of the family, though, the grandparents are very important.
Yeah.
Tell me more about that.
So culture says that grandparents are extras. The Bible says that they're essentials. We define family in the church world primarily as parent and child. And when we do that, we have then just said that grandparents are not part of the family, that they're outside of whatever God's nuclear family is. So we define it as immediate. The Bible defines family as extended, and grandparents are a part of that. And so if family in the Bible includes grandparents, then they have an essential role. They're not an extra. And that is what we see in Scripture, that grandparents are given a role that is God-Ordained. It's not transferable to any other member. So when grandparents don't operate in the role that God's called them, grandchildren have just lost something of incredible value. And so part of what I've had the joy of doing is telling grandparents they matter and that they're given a God-designed role. Primary influences in the lives of kids spiritually, parents are one, we know that. Most people think that other influences that are number 2 would be a church or friends or media. Barna did some research and actually found that it's other family members, usually grandparents, that are number 2. And so we've got millions of Christian grandparents who have been pushed to the side. They've been minimized in churches and society, that are hungry to make a difference and are, for the most part, excited to make a difference. And when given that freedom and invited in and given resources, man, I see grandparents take off. And if literally there are millions of grandparents. I know as a father, I'm a father of 5. I want all the help I can get in raising my kids to know and love Jesus, and to have grandparents come alongside and to support and encourage in that effort is spectacular.
There's a lot of parents that don't want grandparents involved. Can you address that issue? I mean, almost as if somehow grandparents are intruding on the relationship, or grandparents are going to destroy the children, or grandparents are going to do something that's negative toward the children, or steal the children. In Texas, we even have the Texas Homeschool Coalition, We had some grandparent rights bills up for debate last session, and the head of the Texas Homeschool Coalition spoke against grandparents and don't want grandparents more involved in their lives. Perhaps you can address that, to the parent who's saying, we don't want our grandparents around. We don't want their grandparents around.
Well, adult children are the gatekeepers to their parents with their children, with their grandchildren, and if God's given grandparents a biblical role with children, with their grandchildren, then I think it's not pleasing to the Lord for them to say, you can't fulfill the role that God's called grandparents. Obviously, it's not full access in the sense of do whatever you want.
Right.
There needs to be conversations about expectations, and it's a partnership, and so there needs to be that working together. But I don't believe it's pleasing to the Lord to say, we're closing off grandma and grandpa from child. Now I say that in general, obviously.
Right.
Not
There are the exceptions.
Scenarios, right. But culture does say, grandparents, you've heard it, don't meddle, don't interfere, don't be a burden. And the question is, does that align with Scripture? When we actually open up the Bible, is that truly what we see? And there needs to be boundaries. There needs to be an understanding of who does what. Parents are called to be the primary spiritual leaders to raise their kids in the Lord. Grandparents are to come along and to support that effort, to disciple the disciple makers, and then to raise grandchildren in the Lord as well, to pass on that heritage of faith. And so to say to a grandparent, you can't do that, that's that the grandparent that wants to invest spiritually, that's not a good thing.
In fact, if you go back to the book of Deuteronomy in chapter 4, it is almost a command to the grandparents, make sure that you pass this on to your children and to your children's children.
Yep.
There's a whole theology of grandparenting, and I think you mentioned that, that we have become blind to. Biblical culture is very much more extended family, not, as you've said, exclusive immediate family.
Yeah, absolutely, in different cultures. Yeah, it changed in America in about the 1930s when Social Security went into law. It gave families the financial freedom to live independent lives. Prior to the 1930s, what you see in most literature and in the majority of families, there was trigenerational living. And in America, we'll probably go back to that. If finances get tighter for families, you'll see that trigenerational living. But we're in a pretty unique state in America right now to say kind of every family has to live on their own and don't be a burden, don't kind of interfere. And it creates what somebody once said, grandparents, you should aim for closeness at a distance. Not that you can't have closeness at a distance, but distance does make things more challenging. And for most grandparents, they are put at a distance. So if we can avoid that, we obviously want to.
And PhD Roma Hanks, you probably have read her, that she said at the end of the 1990s that grandparenting would be the most important family role for the new century. You're familiar with her statement on that?
Well, in the African American community, if you go and say grandparenting, what many understand that to mean is parenting, simply because of so many fatherless homes.
Right.
And grandparents come in and add an element of last line of defense, a huge support. And we have so many broken homes, not just in African American families, but in all families across America. 40% of kids are born out of wedlock today.
Right.
And grandparents are coming in and adding the foundation, the support, that key influence, that surrogate that we ideally have with a two-parent home. And so absolutely, they're critical today because of that.
So you mentioned that parents are the number one influence, generally speaking, and that grandparents would be second. I know of many instances, and you probably do too, where, as you mentioned, in broken homes or something like that, it is the grandparents who provide the stability, who provide the love, the care, the finances, the guidance. If it weren't for grandparents, you'd see even more devastation. And I'm sure that you're very familiar with that, with your studies and everything else.
Yeah, and I think that's part of God's design for the family, because in a sinful world, there's brokenness, and while we wish everything always turned out great with all of our families, it doesn't. And so grandparents are there in part when that's part of God's built-in support system when it doesn't. And so and that's a blessing. And there's two sets of them, and so we can thank God that that's the next line when things break down.
So your ministry here is?
This is called Renew a Nation.
Okay.
And our goal is to give 1 million children a biblical worldview by 2029, and we do
Okay.
that through the home, parents and grandparents, through education, and as well through the church. So we resource and we help grandparents and parents give a biblical foundation. So the commands in Scripture to grandparents, for example, are Deuteronomy 4:9 that you said, teach these things to your children and children's children. What are these things and how do grandparents teach? And so we address that. We help put resources in hands, and we want kids to grow up to love and know Jesus Christ. Grandparents are critical in that, and how they do that matters.
You know, when I was growing up, it was the highlight of the week to see my grandparents. And I can't imagine why in so many places today we don't go back to that. You know, we talk about the best interest of the child at the very same time that we're smashing the best interest of the child. Parents will love one way, grandparents have the freedom to love in a different way. Not that one's better or anything like that, but they both work together to give a child a sense of who he or she is, the identity, the courage, passing on the heritage to them. When you talk about Deuteronomy chapter 4, it's grandparents telling kids about the great works that the Lord has done. You know, and it's not that maybe the parents don't know the same thing, but the grandparents have been around longer. And I used to love listening to my grandparents tell stories. And anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. Amen.
I appreciate what you're doing. If anybody wants to get more information, how about a contact?
Yeah, renewanation.org.
Renewanation.org.
That's probably the best. You can find my contact info on there or reach me through that route. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. And again, you know, it was pretty amazing to see you that the first thing you would say is, well, this is grandparents. It should be, what, an older set of people out here, right? And here you are representing a much younger group to say that grandparents are important. Thank you for what you're doing. Thank you.